You are listening to I Am Refocused Radio with your host, Shamaya Reed. This show is designed to inspire you to live your purpose and regain your focus. And now, here's your host, Shamaya Reed.
Hey, welcome to I Am Refocused Radio. We are here once again. And today, just like any other show, we have a special guest. We're going to talk to Douglas Garland, and he is the author of the Tall Poppies Syndrome. And we're going to learn all about what this is and what it means for you. And without any hesitation, I just want to welcome you, sir, to the show and say, how you doing tonight, man?
I'm very good. Very clear where I am out here in sunny California.
That's a great place to be. I mean, that's a nice area right there. So you are the author of the Tall Poppies Syndrome. And this is an interesting topic because how many of us find ourselves guilty of cutting someone else down? So for the audience, can you please define what this is and also what it means?
So the metaphor of the Tall Poppies Syndrome is seeing a field of poppies, and one poppy is taller than the rest, and the tendency then is to want to cut that poppy down so all are the same size. So that's just a general concept of what it means. Of course, everything is always more complicated once you start looking into it. So the syndrome is very complex, but the idea is very simple, that we all want to be equal. And when you think about it, it starts in your childhood, usually with your parents. I mean, my parents did it to me. There were 7 in my family. I did it to my 2 daughters, and I, to a certain extent, do it to my 4 grandkids. I want to be equal. If I give one $10, then for their birthday, then I got to make sure I give the other 3 $10 for their birthday. I don't want to show any favoritism. So that concept starts in your family, and it's carried through into schools. The schools now are more, everybody gets a trophy, so the schools try and keep you equal. And your tribe, who you hang out with, you drift to people that are in the same income, socioeconomic status. And if one hits the jackpot, that they're either going to move out of that group or there's going to be, unfortunately, a tendency to continue to subconsciously cut that person down so that your group always stays equal. So that's kind of how it works. I actually was introduced to the syndrome by an Australian, and where it's a part of their pastime or their culture there. The society in Australia was founded as a penal colony for England. And of course, all prisoners are equal. And that's the way that society began. And for the most part, that's the way it still is. It was that introduction that caused me to want to research the subject. I'd done a lot of research in my medical field. So I started really with the Greeks, and it was the Tall Poppy Syndrome was actually described by Herodotus, the great Greek historian and the father of, so to speak, history. In his case, he used wheat fields. He cut off the heads of wheat when he originally described it. And once you understand that concept, dated back to Grecian times, and think about it, Socrates himself was tall poppied. He drank the hemlock, but he drank the poison because he was falsely accused by people in his city. And rather than cause more problems, he drank the hemlock. So he was described in ancient Greece, and Socrates himself cut himself down, but was due to the actions of the public. And then the next description comes from Livy, the Roman historian, and he actually used the poppy in lopping off the heads of poppies. As it happened, he described Rome was initially a kingdom. There were 7 kings before it became a republic. And the last king, King Tarquin, had his son Sextus ruling adjacent town. His son was having a hard time ruling the populace. And he sent a messenger back to his dad, and his dad walked out to a poppy field and leveled all the tall poppies down. The messenger went back, explained to Sextus what had happened, and he realized that his father meant for him to lop off the heads of all the opposition leaders. So that, and the good example then, of course, is Caesar was tall poppied. So it's way back, and I looked through most countries, through most time periods, and I found the tall poppy syndrome throughout history in most countries and most cultures. The striking thing to me was that America didn't seem to have it. So my original preface for the book was that individualism in America, we're the only country that's a true individualist society, that it was our individualism that was protecting and worshiping the individual, that we let the tall poppies grow tall. But when I began to look at the country itself, I had to change the conclusion that tall poppy syndrome is more prevalent here than any country that I studied. And it is because of our meritocracy and our competition. Plus, we have more tall poppies in America than any other country. So it's our meritocracy and our competition that causes us to cut each other down. If we can't bet ourselves and be better than the competition, then we want to cut them down. All you have to do is look at politics and see that example every day play out. And the next thing that becomes problematic with the simple metaphor is that my tall poppy is not necessarily your tall poppy. So you just have to work through that. I can't help you with that. But another problem is that most tall poppies that get cut down aren't tall poppy. So in the book, I label regular people as peer-to-peer tall poppy syndrome. That means that it's happening in your tribe. So it happens in your family, it happens in school, it happens at work. Nobody ever hears about that. But the tall poppy syndrome is happening every day to people in your tribe. And I differentiated that then from the true tall poppy. And the true tall poppy is a public figure. They do some egregious activity. They usually cut themselves down, and then the public feels justified in cutting them down. So we can take the Will Smith, Chris Rock example of the tall poppy syndrome. Chris Rock made a remark which was meant, I think, to be funny, and the interpretation of Will Smith was that it wasn't funny, or his wife didn't think it was funny, and he literally and figuratively tried to cut Chris Rock down. And the emotions drive the tall poppy syndrome. The emotions in the peer-to-peer group is driven by the cutter, and usually it's envy. Envy clear back to Aristotle in Grecian times, ancient Greece, was divided into good and bad envy. Good envy is seeing somebody that's better than you. Envy is our comparison emotion. And good envy would be, I like that person's looks, I like that person's car, I like that person's clothes, I like his physique or her physique. I want to be like that person. So you self-improve. You move yourself up a notch to be able to be like that person you admire. Bad envy is looking at that person. Usually is found in someone with a little more low self-esteem and thinking that you can't improve yourself, and so you try to cut that person down. And that happens in the family, familial envy. Happened in the Bible. Cain and Abel is an example of that. Then it happens in school, happens in college. Was a physician. Happened a lot in my medical profession, and of course within your own tribe. Now, the public tall poppy is a different set of emotions. And I mentioned that it happens usually because of egregious behavior by the tall poppy. That egregious behavior is driven by three emotions. The most common emotion is just pride. Will Smith had pride. He thought he was powerful enough and that he could walk up onto the stage in front of an international audience and pull that trick off. So it was the pride that drove that. The other thing that we see common in America is greed. And the third thing in America that we frequently see is lust. So the tall poppy syndrome is driven by emotions, and they're different in the tall poppy as far as being cut down versus the peer-to-peer or more common person, where the emotions tend to be bad envy, anger, and in many cases, just laziness. The person isn't willing to do a little bit effort to improve himself, so he cuts the other person down. And the easiest way to remember those emotions and the tall poppy syndrome complex are the 7 deadly sins. I just gave you 6 of the 7 deadly sins. Laziness, anger, envy, found in the cutter, and in the tall poppy, the egregious behavior is driven by pride, greed, and lust. The only thing we have left out is gluttony. So if you think about the behavior of people, you understand the syndrome, and you can frequently differentiate whether the cutter is the problem or it's the tall poppy, the egregious behavior of the tall poppy, and what their problem is, and whether it was justified to cut that person down. And that should allow you then to reflect on your own confirmation bias, or looking sort of out the window at what's happening around you and self-reflect on your own behavior. So once again, if we look at the Will Smith, Chris Rock, people thought Chris Rock's behavior was okay. Some people thought that Will Smith was justified in walking up there. So I have no opinion on that. That's your own bias, and your bias is directing who you favored in that situation. So the fact that you understand the tall poppy syndrome and emotional makeup should also help you reflect on what your biases are and what your own behavior is, especially if it's peer-to-peer and you're having difficulty with someone. Are you the problem, or were they really the problem? Do you need to improve your behavior, or do you need to modify your behavior?
That makes sense. Once again, we're listening to I Am Refocused Radio, talking to Douglas Garland. go to his website, douggarland.com, and we're discussing his book, The Tall Poppy Syndrome. And it's very interesting what you're saying, because I can definitely see that, how we can. Well, let me ask you this: is it possible that a person could do this just because that they feel threatened by someone else's success?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
And it could, and I didn't mean to cut you off, but could it also, in addition to that, could it be that they're just not aware that they're cutting people down?
Yeah, that's so. That's my point about there's frequently three people. So let's say you're in your peer group, and when you're not emotionally involved, you're better to stand back and look at, say, you have two of your neighbors are arguing over whatever they're arguing about. Since you're not in the heat of the battle, you can, and you understand the behavior of both people, well, I can see his point or I can see their point. In the end, you should cause some reflection on your own bias of what you're looking at and why you're favoring one person over the other, and maybe you're a problem too. So can be a lot of growth within yourself when you see the tall poppy syndrome happen.
And also, when it comes to the political system, how has this also affect that as well, as far as how people view politics?
Well, yes. I mean, always in competition, there's the potential for the tall poppy syndrome to occur when you have a winner loser. I mean, in the legal profession and within the people themselves and the people that are caught in it, there's always a win-lose situation. And anytime you have that, you're going to have the tall poppy syndrome. Now, is it going to be legal or legitimate? Unfortunately, even it seems in our American system at this time, even the rules are being bent. And so was the real problem the judge? So that the syndrome, as I mentioned, is very straightforward, but the interpretation of it becomes very complex. And the more complex society is, the more you have to dig in to decide who the cutter is, if the cuttee was deserving, or what people's roles in it. But, we used to be a country of abundance, and everybody had the chance to share in that abundance. And as that abundance disappears and we move into scarcity and the competition becomes more intense to reach the abundance, or even because of the scarcity factor, it creates more competition. And I do think that's why I think the tall poppy syndrome has become very prevalent in America. The millennials feel that the American dream is out of their reach now. They used to be, when I grew up, I'm 78, I grew up in the 50s. The 50s was after World War II, and it was just a time of hope. And if you had the glass always seemed full. There was nothing you couldn't do. There was nothing you couldn't reach. And our times have changed now that, the wages stagnated. It's home prices inflated. College has inflated. So the American dream seems out of reach, and the glass looks more half empty, I think, at this time than in the 50s, for example. I mean, it's almost back to the 1900s when America was struggling as a society, and industrialization was going on, and people were really struggling. And the glass was half empty. The glass was mostly full in the 50s, and I think the glass is is more half empty now, and that creates a peer-to-peer problem and more opportunity for the bad envy to rise and more chance for the tall poppy syndrome to thrive.
Once again, listen to Refocus Radio, talking to Douglas Garland and Tall Poppies. This is a very interesting topic. You also, on your website, you have made a list of historical figures and recent, I guess you say, influencers. We have a platform who are tall poppies and victims. Now, this list that you put together, is it safe to say that we, as those who are listening to this right now, we can probably find a list, and if we're truthful, we might find ourselves on this list?
Absolutely. Once I explain the syndrome to people, they automatically say, you know what? They'll remember the date. They'll remember, you know what? Back so-and-so, I was tall poppy by this person. I can tell you another example. I was just recently doing a podcast. We finished the podcast, and the gentleman that I was having the podcast said, you know what? And I go, what? And he goes, you know what? I'm being tall poppied right now. You know, I belong to this board. I'm the president. And one of the members is trying to undercut me. So, yes, once you see it, and I go through countries. I go through China. I go through Rome. I go through Greece. I go through Holland, which is a very egalitarian country. I go through the Nordic countries, which are very egalitarian. I go through Canada, which is very egalitarian. And I go through examples of the tall poppy syndrome in each of these countries to show how prevalent it is in all societies and in all times. And once you read the book, it really helps you understand the syndrome, and you see examples of this. And then all of a sudden you start seeing it around you in your neighborhoods, in your school districts, and especially in Hollywood and sports, in all our high-profile true tall poppies. And you can compile a list of tall poppies. I mean, Steve Jobs was tall poppied. Bill Gates was tall poppied. Jeff Bezos, I can tell you a really fascinating story right now. Jeff Bezos built a $500 million boat in the Netherlands, and he built it inland. And the only way he could get it out to the water was through the canals over there. And of course, there's going to be bridges on the canal. So one of the cities wouldn't let him tear the bridge down in order to move his boat out. I mean, he offered to pay for it, take it apart, probably build it back better than it was, but they wouldn't let him do it. So that's an example in a very egalitarian country, very different from ours, and sort of cutting Jeff Bezos down. So the book is really a psychosocial history of the world viewed through the eye of the tall poppy syndrome. It's in some ways, I think, a very fascinating read to look at how people and emotions drove society, not necessarily events. I mean, Hitler, cut people down. Napoleon cut people down. So those are big emotional giants, and they cut down people. But when I do the book, it's more looking at people and their emotions driving history, not events driving history. It's kind of an interesting take on the world, of course, in my opinion.
And so it's focusing more so on high status of individual success.
Yes.
Well, once again, been talking to Doug Garland and his very awesome, interesting book, The Tall Poppy Syndrome. And when people are educating themselves, because this seems like something you can't just digest in one take. It's going to be something you're going to have to kind of explore. What's one thing that you hope individuals who read your book will learn from what you're trying to bring across?
Well, I think all you have to do is go to Amazon and look the book up, The Tall Poppy Syndrome, and click on reviews. And the reviews that I have for the book are very intelligent. And you only have to read the first couple reviews, and they're going to say, I didn't expect this to be a self-help book, but I greatly improved myself by reading this book. And that's what it does. You're reading about other people, but you're seeing people's behavior, and it makes you reflect on your own behavior. And in doing so, hopefully, you will improve. I mean, the world is presently being driven, if you think about it, the world is being driven by the internet. And all these selfies, everything people are doing is being driven. This is peer-to-peer comparison, and it's all by bad envy. You go out to the restaurant, you take your selfie of this with 2 or 3 friends, and you're having fancy drinks and fancy food, and you send that back to somebody's at home watching TV or studying or whatever they're doing. And that drives bad envy, and drives a lot of depression and anger. But it's really the comparison emotion, and that drives the internet now. And as you know, there's a lot of bad things happening on social media. It drives suicides and things. So when you're looking at the internet, having the tall poppy syndrome metaphor in your mind helps you monitor the internet and what's going on out there. The behavior is not exactly example setting.
Once again, I want to say thank you to you, Douglas Garland, for taking time in your schedule talking to Unrecognized Radio about your book, The Tall Poppy Syndrome. Once again, go to DougGarland.com. Again, that's DougGarland.com. I just want to say thank you, sir, once again, taking time in your schedule talking to us today.
It's been my pleasure.